Picture the richest man in the palace. He commands armies of servants, whispers policy into the emperor's ear, and owns more silver than most noble houses combined. Now picture him coming home, to a wife, to a household, to a son who will one day kneel at his grave and burn offerings for his soul. That sentence shouldn't make sense. This man was castrated as a boy. He was never supposed to have a family at all. And yet, for over 1,000 years of Chinese imperial history, eunuchs married, openly, legally, and so commonly that court writers eventually complained you could barely find a powerful eunuch who hadn't done it. Who were the women standing beside these men, then? History has worked hard to make sure we never really find out. That's what we're unpacking today. Let's start with the obvious problem. An emperor kept hundreds, sometimes thousands, of women inside the palace walls. Consorts, concubines, maids. He needed men to manage that world who could never, under any circumstance, father a child inside it. Castration wasn't an unfortunate side effect of the job. It was the job requirement. No blade, no position. On its face, the idea of a eunuch's wife sounds almost like a joke, a contradiction built into the very architecture of the system. And yet, by the final century of the Ming dynasty, with tens of thousands of eunuchs serving the court, marriage among them wasn't rare. It was the norm. Understanding how something this improbable became this ordinary is where the real story begins. The custom didn't begin in a throne room. It began in a kitchen. Palace life for a low-ranking eunuch was long cold and almost unbearably lonely. For much of the Ming dynasty, eunuchs didn't even have proper kitchens of their own. Many ate reheated scraps over a small pan of charcoal, if they were lucky enough to have that. Palace maids, on the other hand, often did have access to small kitchens. They could actually cook a warm meal. Out of that imbalance, quiet partnerships formed. A eunuch might help a maid get better cloth, a bit of jewelry, extra food, small comforts that made her life more bearable inside the walls. In return, she'd cook, and the two would eat together, facing one another across a single small table. It was such a recognized arrangement that it had its own name, a term that essentially meant two people eating face to face, so neither had to eat alone. If the bond deepened and became permanent, it graduated into something closer to an actual household. Pooled money, shared living quarters, a loyalty that was treated, in practice, like a marriage vow. Some couples reportedly swore private oaths to each other, promising exclusivity for the rest of their lives. This wasn't scandal. It was two people, near the bottom of a rigid hierarchy, finding the only warmth available to them. Now rewind further to the Tang dynasty, roughly 1,000 years earlier. Here, eunuch marriage wasn't a quiet arrangement whispered about below stairs. It was public, political, and enormously lucrative. Consider one of the most powerful eunuchs of the era, a man who served as the right hand of the emperor himself and was reportedly wealthier than half the aristocracy. When he married, his wife's family transformed overnight. Her father, a minor and largely powerless official before the wedding, was elevated all the way to a senior ministerial post. Relatives across the family suddenly held government positions. When his mother-in-law died, the funeral procession was said to stretch for a staggering distance, a river of mourners and carriages befitting royalty. For a struggling family in Tang, China, marrying a daughter to a powerful eunuch wasn't a nightmare scenario. It was closer to winning the lottery. Some eunuch wives even ran their households as genuine partners, managing estates and affairs of state, indistinguishable on paper from the wife of any nobleman. Less a cage than a ladder then. Hold that thought, because the empire itself violently disagreed. When the founder of the Ming dynasty rose to power, he looked at the practice of eunuchs marrying palace women and was disgusted. He didn't just discourage it, he outlawed it, and set the punishment at something almost unimaginable: being flayed alive. Think about what kind of fear produces a law that extreme. It wasn't really about morality. It was about power. A eunuch was supposed to be a dead end. No sons, no clan, no bloodline to fight for. That powerlessness is exactly what made him safe to hand authority to. But give that same eunuch a wife, and suddenly he has in-laws, a network, ambition, ammunition. A married eunuch wasn't a servant anymore. He was the seat of a faction. The ban failed anyway. Within a few generations, emperors themselves were promoting and relying on eunuchs so heavily that the old law became unenforceable. Marriages came roaring back, and by the late Ming, with the eunuch population swelling toward 100,000, one court writer simply noted that a powerful eunuch without a wife had become the unusual case, not the rule. This is the real question the whole video is built around, and the honest answer has two very different sides. Side one: for some women, this was genuinely a life sentence. Being handed to a eunuch, with no say in the matter, could feel like being buried alive, especially for a woman with any other prospects at all. We know some resisted with everything they had. Historical records mention young women who, rather than accept such a marriage, shaved their heads and disappeared into Buddhist convents. Others reportedly chose to end their lives, rather than walk into the arrangement, treating that refusal as the last decision, still theirs to make. And the danger inside these marriages could be real. These were men who had often been mutilated as children, sometimes sold by desperate families, and who carried humiliation from a society that mocked them as not fully men. That kind of trauma doesn't simply vanish. Historical accounts describe eunuchs who were cruel to the wives bound to them. Women who had no nearby family, no protector, and effectively no way out. Side 2: a huge amount of the cruelty attached to this story isn't history. It's propaganda. For roughly 2,000 years, China's official histories were written by Confucian officials who viewed eunuchs as their bitter political rivals. Eunuchs became the convenient villain in histories, novels, and plays, greedy, monstrous, especially toward women. It was an easy, lazy narrative, and it stuck. It got worse in the modern era. Much of the extreme, sensational cruelty still circulating online about the late Qing court traces back to a Western writer whose supposedly first-hand account of the Imperial court was later exposed as largely fabricated. For decades, other authors quoted his invented details as established fact, and the fabrication blended into the historical record until it became almost impossible to separate real cruelty from manufactured scandal. Here's the pattern worth sitting with. These women were trapped once by the system that handed them off with no say. Then they were erased a second time by historians who flattened their husbands into cartoon villains and reduced their own lives to salacious footnotes, until the actual women simply disappeared from the record. One of the only named wives we have from the Qing dynasty is a woman in her late teens, married to one of the Empress Dowager's favorite eunuchs. Her entire historical record amounts to little more than a name, an age, and her husband's title. We don't get her voice. We don't get her story. Her husband, meanwhile, met a violent political end before turning 30. Proof that even the most powerful eunuchs were disposable. And the women married to them were disposable twice, once by the men who controlled their lives, and once by the men who wrote the histories. If marriage could be this risky, why did it persist for centuries, right up until the fall of the dynasty? The answer is less about romance and more about the terror of dying utterly alone. A eunuch's usefulness inside the palace had an expiration date. When he grew old, sick, or simply fell out of favor, he was dismissed and stepped into a world that despised him. Having been cut, sold, or sent away as a boy, many were treated as an embarrassment by their own relatives. Some cast-off eunuchs ended up as beggars. A grim number are said to have drowned themselves near the palace they had once served. But there was something worse waiting than poverty. In traditional belief, your soul's fate after death depended on your descendants. Sons and grandsons tending your grave, burning offerings, keeping your name alive on the family altar. A man with no descendants risked becoming a hungry ghost, forgotten, unflayed, wandering forever. And a castrated man wasn't only unable to have children, he was often barred from being buried in his own family's ancestral plot at all, considered to have broken the body his parents gave him. Look at that math. No children by force of surgery, no ancestral grave by force of custom. That's not one death waiting at the end of a eunuch's life. It's two. Suddenly marriage looks less strange and more like the only rational move available. A eunuch would marry, then adopt an heir, often a nephew or a young boy taken in as a son. That gave him a household, someone to care for him in old age, and crucially, someone to inherit his name, sweep his grave, and burn offerings so his soul would be remembered instead of forgotten. The marriage functioned as a retirement plan and an escape hatch from spiritual oblivion, rolled into one. And for the humbler kitchen, partnership pairings among lower-ranking eunuchs and maids. The arrangement cut both ways. It was survival for the woman too. A palace maid with a eunuch partner had an ally, someone whose small amount of influence could shield her when a higher-ranking official came down hard. Two people near the bottom of a brutal hierarchy, tying themselves together so that neither one drowned alone. You can still see traces of this today. Buried from their family tombs, wealthy eunuchs built their own. On the western edge of Beijing, a temple complex grew up around the grave of a favored Ming-era eunuch, where other eunuchs were laid to rest together. A family of men who could have no families of their own, buried in the only lineage available to them, each other. Let's end with the eunuch who supposedly won at all of it. He served as the Empress Dowager's chief eunuch for nearly 50 years and became the wealthiest eunuch of the entire Qing dynasty. Born into a desperately poor family and castrated as a boy, he clawed his way up to become the most important gatekeeper in China. Officials reportedly bribed him just to be heard. He did everything the system promised: married, adopted heirs, built the full arrangement a poor, discarded eunuch could only dream of. But after the Empress Dowager died, he quietly left the Forbidden City. And within 3 years, he too was dead. Some accounts claim his enormous fortune was seized after his death. And when his tomb was finally opened decades later, there was treasure inside, but no body, only a head and a braid of hair. What happened to the rest of him? To the fortune? To the wife who was supposed to inherit it all? The record goes silent, exactly the way it always goes silent around these people. Most of these women were married to some of the most documented men in Chinese history, and they themselves were left almost entirely blank. Not because they didn't matter, but because the people writing history decided they didn't. If you found this as fascinating as we did, let us know in the comments which piece of hidden history we should dig into next. We read every single one.